Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for February 9th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Matt Kaiser. Welcome, Matt.
How's it going, Brian?
Doing well, thanks. And how about you?
Pretty well, actually. Had an interesting weekend. There was an interesting release of old malware to the Internet Archive. So Jason Scott, who's a well-known Internet archivist, paired up with Mikko Hyppinen of F-Secure to put a collection of old malware. I think a lot of this was Mikko's personal collection of things he'd found from the DOS and Windows 3.1 era onto archive.org. And the cool thing is they've sort of defanged the malware and they've got it in emulation software called DOSBox. So you can actually open up your browser and run it and see what somebody would have seen when they got infected back in the day.
Oh, very cool. You know, I think there may be some actual benefit to this, in my opinion. That is especially for folks that have been doing security analysis for a long time, you start to recognize that there really is very little revolution in security, or actually in the attacks themselves. That a lot of it's very evolutionary, and that having some history examples can help folks, particularly if they're new to security and trying to learn things, how things have been evolving. And I think it'll make them better security analysts going forward to be able to see, you know, this is where we've been and understand where we're going. You know, what's the old adage of, you know, those that don't understand history
we're doomed
are
to repeat it.
Yeah. Stan Nurilov, welcome.
Thank you, Brian.
It's good to see you here again.
Yep.
And online we have John Markley. Welcome, John.
Morning or afternoon.
And I'm Brian Rexroad, and we're going to go ahead and jump into, I guess, the first story with you, Matt. And I guess we all have our experience with bugs. Can you tell us a little bit about this one?
Sure. So this one's kind of an interesting one, in my opinion. So Checkpoint had a blog post recently talking about a bug that one of their researchers found on eBay. And within eBay's website, obviously people can sell their own things. They can set up little stores for themselves. Turns out that eBay allows a certain amount of active content. And they do some filtering in order to prevent malicious content from being added to that. Unfortunately, it turns out that their filter wasn't doing such a good job. And there's actually a very interesting JavaScript packing tool, the name of which I really can't say on the air, but you know, it's written by a guy named Martin Klepp. Go look it up, and
so
you'll
it
see
probably had a little bit of malicious intent in that.
Well, I don't know. I've seen it used legitimately. I've also seen it used in exploit kits. So it's a packer. People will use it for different reasons. But in this case, it turns out that you can use this packer to take pretty much any JavaScript and compact it down to, well, let's not say compact. You can take the set of characters and limit it to 6 characters, which is, it's like, I'm trying to find a metaphor for it. It's like trying to build a house using only sticks of a certain length.
Sounds like Mastercraft. Or Minecraft.
Minecraft. I mean. It's a little like programming malware in Minecraft. But it turns out that bypassed the filter, and there were some demo videos they showed. Originally, it sounded like eBay said they weren't going to fix it, but then there was an update on Ars Technica where they said they've worked with them, they've come up with a couple of filters to add, and they stressed that the number of people actually using active content within eBay is somewhat small, and therefore this shouldn't be a problem. I tend to disagree with that. I think now that this is in the news, there will be more people trying to use this now that it's public. But it sounds like they've patched it, so that's good.
You know, this reminds me of a bugging thing. So we were talking a little bit about history. This goes, I think, significantly back. I think it was actually, I'm not exactly sure how much detail I could go into here, but it was a case where they had basically bugged some typewriters. I think they only did it on maybe 6 keys or so. And so, but just by the stroking of the keys and the signals that they would generate, it was possible to actually reassemble the text associated with that.
The timing between each key type, and you can say, well, this guy types at this rate, and therefore you know that the A is here, and there's maybe 2 letters, and then another C.
It may have had enough to do with the frequency that you know, with just those letters, you were able to assemble the full thing. It wouldn't work in a coding sense, but if you're reading, you've ever seen one of those old tests where, you know, the words can get all jumbled around and you can still read it just fine? It was one of those kinds of scenarios, I believe, that despite the blanks, you could still tell it was what, and you only had to code a few things. But anyway, I digress. So perhaps a similar kind of philosophy here. So again, recognizing current activities, perhaps things that were based on, maybe not based on, but we perhaps would know about from some time ago. So, all right, well, that's an interesting story, being able to pack things into a set of 6 characters and get past the checks. So Stan, let's go to you. And I guess Google's always looking for ways to try to make the world a little bit more secure. So,
yeah, this one's actually a pet peeve of mine, but I'm glad to see that Google's doing something about it. So I don't know if you've ever had this experience. You go on a website, you're looking to download something. You're downloading some kind of open source package or something similar, and you get to the website, and the download link is somewhere in an obscure location, but it's surrounded by advertisements that say download, or your computer needs update or something like that. And that's probably not where you want to click. And there's even, for some advertisers, there is an option to go and report things like that. But Google has decided to do something about it. So if you're familiar with unsafe browsing, and if you go to a malicious website, Google will give you like a little red page that says, hey, you're about to go somewhere unsafe. You have the option to continue, or you can back off. Well, they're going to start doing something similar for websites that have a consistent behavior where they're putting these kinds of ads onto the website. So hopefully that changes some of that behavior, because I know it's certainly very deceptive quite often. I'm not really looking to click on the download link in the advertisement. I'm looking for the download link for what I came for. So I'm glad that they're doing something about it. I've actually myself many times have reported these kinds of advertisements. So I'd like to think that this is something I contributed to. All those advertisements I marked as inappropriate have finally come to this policy decision.
Right. So is this generally, is this basically a crowdsourced thing that based on reports, they're using that as a means to do it?
The article didn't specify how they're doing this, but I'd like to think that they do take those kinds of metrics back, because you can, for certain ads they have, there's about 3 options that you have that lets you kind of choose what kind of advertisements you'd like to see. And I know I certainly think about all the people, like whenever I submit one for inappropriate for something like that, I think about my mom or my dad, and they're looking for the link to something, and here they're being tricked to do something else.
Right.
So
I agree. But just taking the counterpoint for the moment, just for the sake of argument, I think this is a very difficult thing to do, and that's one of the reasons I asked about the crowdsourcing. That is, how do you define deceptive? Deceptive could be very different for different people even. And so I think having some sort of a rating system behind it to be able to support it. Otherwise, it's kind of like, how do you define a situation where the company, Google in this particular case, how do you distinguish making a judgment against organizations versus actually trying to protect the users? It's a very
I guess we were going with
tricky
that
thing.
because as Google has business interests, and deciding that some ads are okay and some are not based on their own business interests is not the same as acting in the best interest of the internet. So if they decided this advertisers' ads are misleading and therefore I will filter them out, good for us, we're doing the right thing. Well, maybe and maybe not. I've also seen ads that have, they have the big green download here button, and at the very bottom in tiny text it says, clicking this will bring you to our advertiser's site, which I'm guessing is their way of trying to get out of, if someone asks, hey, this isn't a download button, I'm like, no, we clearly say that at the bottom. So that's their way of weaseling out of it. Yeah.
Clearly in the little 1 pixel.
If you hover your mouse over this pixel here, it tells you everything.
Right, so anyway, I think that's more and more, I think the challenge of security really comes down to the challenge of managing deception. And I know of no better solution than the crowdsourcing, that is, let the public help rate that as a means to do it. So it'll be interesting to see how they implement it and how transparent it is in terms of the judgment, how the judgments are being made. Of course, then again, you have to deal with, if there is transparency in the judgments, then you come up against those that are manipulating the judgment. So.
Well, I think the other twist to this, Brian, too, is there's a lot of these downloads that are packages, right? So they have more than one piece of software in the download. Do they consider that deceptive, or is that just part of the bundling that you went to that site to download?
Yes, that's true, and more, the sort of promotional type bundling is taking place. And again, I don't think it's necessarily malicious, but it can be deceptive. can end up with people that end up with things that they didn't really intend. It's a tricky matter to deal with. So John, let's go to you. And speaking of deceptive, this is an interesting one. There have been a lot of stories about this kind of thing, but I'm interested in hearing about this particular example.
I'm glad you weren't talking about me personally being deceptive, Brian. I was a little uncomfortable there for a second. But, there was a story that hit the news. A company out of Moscow, actually, called Dr. Web, published an article saying that they had found some malware that was taking a fairly unique twist on how it was being delivered to Android phones, especially since it was, it said that these apps were actually on the Google Play Store. So what the users were doing were getting these apps, putting them on their devices, according to Dr. Web, that is, and then getting this malware installed on the device. And so the interesting thing is what it would do is it would send a picture to the phone. And so, if you think about it from a monitoring perspective, we don't look at, if you're doing a network traffic analysis, you're not looking at a picture coming in. That usually doesn't trigger anything. We're looking at going to this, being redirected to a different URL, going to a particular site or some kind of command and control. We don't look at this. This actually pulled a picture to the device, and then what it did is it actually had the malicious app had some content where it could take that picture apart and actually translate that into an APK and then install that as like a separate app on the device. Really cool, trick by embedding that in the picture, to avoid detection, right. and then disassembling that and making it and reassembling it as an APK. This is the only group that I've seen that has talked about this yet. So this is maybe just a start of a trend of some new, very tricky and intense malware being installed.
Mm-hmm. So this is a case where it's actually embedded in the picture, as opposed to there have been lots and lots of attacks on like Windows devices where they rename a file to be a JPEG or something like that. It's not really an image at all, but because of it ends up being recognized as an executable thing in a sense, and then ends up being executed perhaps as a completely different thing. This is different than that. Is that correct?
Correct. That's absolutely correct. This is actually it's actually embedded in the picture. So it's not. It's they have to take that picture apart. So it's kind of hidden within it. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of that. But it's really for me that was a really unique attack vector.
Right. Now, is this a vulnerability in a particular set of code, or is it just really just a perhaps an oversight and how would you characterize
I think we're going to
it?
see. Yeah, I think we're going to start seeing some groups, like Google, some of these app store companies start looking at how to prevent somebody doing something like this, like hiding it. It's kind of like thinking, every other bit, if you think about the old, like Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, coded Alice Liddell in the poem at the start of the book. If you look at the first letter of every character, or the third letter, you can make different things. It's kind of that same, maybe we'll start seeing that every third bit, which maybe has no other value, is actually going to be used to be translated into something else. Kind of neat. So, but I think some of the recommendations, people have to understand before we detect this is you still, of course, never get it from anything but approved app stores. A lot of this stuff comes from what they call knockoffs. So, like if somebody comes up with some brand new, state-of-the-art game or somebody everybody's playing, you go look for a free version of it. You avoid those knockoffs. Rooting the device, and then just generally be aware what's on the device. Kind of keep an eye out for, unusual behavior, or if it asks for additional permissions that you say, well, why did I just download this game? Why is it needing access to my phone? Those are things just, it's the stuff we talk about, I think, every week. But it's kind of neat. But again, this vector, this what they call steganography is a pretty neat little attack vector we just really haven't seen much of in the last 50 years. It's been around forever.
It's been around for a long time, but usually associated with spies and that little microdot or something like that. This is getting it into sort of the mainstream is fascinating and scary.
There's actually a couple of websites out there that'll let you upload the picture, and they'll look for stego like this, where the least significant bit or something like that. So
Inconsistencies in the way it's coded.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question for John, actually. Are they using steganography? Is that confirmed? Or are they simply inserting the APK content midway through the JPEG? Because you'll still have somewhat of a standard JPEG file. It'll render, I guess, but...
Yeah, no, it is actually steganography. They're actually taking bits here and there based on a certain pattern to take it from this part and this part and this part. So that it's not just like embedded and encased within like a section of code. It's chopped up and divided up into the L picture.
Cool. All right.
So steganography. I think we all understand what steganography is. I mean, this is kind of a good built picture of a tree. Pulled that off of Wikipedia. I think Sid uploaded originally. And so, you look at that, you don't see anything, but then you look, what's embedded in it, you'll actually see the cat that's embedded within that picture. And you don't see that cat. You see it? No, but it's there.
Well, look closely. It's actually about halfway up the tree on the right.
I don't think so.
Now the rug, on the other hand, that was not in the tree. Yeah, very good, John. So this is again, this is an interesting thing. As you pointed out, steganography has been around for a long time, but it's generally associated with James Bond like spy activities, and to see it coming out into the sort of the common domain of malware is an interesting thing. I think that's been one of our fundamental challenges. I tend to think back to the von Neumann architecture. Stan's nodding his head, but Matt, you apparently have a problem with history. Is that
apparently I do today.
In the von Neumann architecture, there's a clear distinction between the data and the code. Okay. And so, but we've blurred that. And as we've blurred that, it's become more of a security issue because data, a picture, can be at least or have attributes of code embedded in it. And we've got all kinds of flavors in between, where things are predominantly data, but they're really code, or they're predominantly code, but they're really data kind of things. These are the kinds of things that we've introduced by just, genericizing the computer architecture and just making, here's memory and there's stuff in there. It could be data or code. So anyway, it's been one of my pet peeves for quite some time, but I don't think we're going back. That ship has left the harbor. Given the scenario that we have, the situation we have, I happened to run across an article, and it is actually titled How to Secure Amazon Web Services. I'm not necessarily promoting Amazon Web Services here. In fact, I like to, having looked at the article, I think there are a lot of principles that are in this article that I think are very good for folks to take a look at if they're using cloud services or considering using cloud services. And it kind of starts out right at the beginning, saying Amazon protects the infrastructure. They provide the protection of the cloud infrastructure itself. But securing your cloud applications and the environment that you're working in really is up to you. And so this is really providing some tips along those lines. So the first one they point out is that, this is a quote from the article here, don't let the developers run the show. I don't think that's exactly, it's a little insinuative, but really what it comes down to is, creating cloud images ahead of time that the developer organization or that the application developers would use with the basic security practices and configurations in place so that you don't have to be worried about the developers doing those things. So I think that perhaps a better way of describing this is don't depend on the development team that's under pressure to create features and get applications out there to actually be, they may be interested in security and doing it right, but it's not necessarily their priority. So you have to do some things ahead of time or behind the scenes to help them out in doing that. So, and this is very similar to the practices that we've been putting into place in terms of our use of cloud activities as well. So very consistent. And then the second thing they sort of point out is make sure you provide a separation between the test environment, that is set up a cloud infrastructure for test, and a cloud infrastructure for applications. Try to keep those things separate because you don't want a flaw in the development to be able to extend into your production applications. Second one, very straightforward, take away the user accounts. That is, particularly when you're starting to mechanize and automate things, create accounts that are specifically for APIs and give them only the privileges that they need. So we call that the concept of least privilege or separation of duties in a sense that we implement as a part of our policies, good practices in general. And with the opportunities that APIs provide you, it gives you an opportunity to really constrain and actually understand what a particular user should be able to do. It makes the security analyst's challenge much more simple, because anything outside that bound should be a strong flag of a problem. The next one here is basically use the tools that are made available to you. You know, a cloud service provider, a good cloud service provider, and by the way, I think these are attributes that you want to look for in a cloud service provider. That is, you know, they may have certificate management functions, encryption tools, hardware security modules, you know, for storing keys, you know, and I think that's kind of an important thing. That is, you know, when you're trying to protect private keys, having hardware that's designed for that really helps to prevent, you know, Heartbleed was a big problem because the OpenSSL library could potentially expose the keys. If your keys are protected in hardware, it helps to prevent you from that kind of a threat. So having a hardware module for doing that, you know, FIPS 140 basically specifies requirements for that type of thing. And then, you know, web application firewalls, you want to be able to put a firewall in front of your thing. We have a big program internally to virtualize security functions around cloud applications. So those are some of the things that you might want to look for. Treat security like software development. That is, security needs to be tested just like the software needs to be tested. And if you find problems with it, treat it like it's a, you know, just a system outage, just like anything else. I know, I recall basically using this scenario like, you know, a person has had a problem with their computer and they'd say, you know, what am I supposed to do? Well, pretend it caught fire. How would you treat that situation? And it's a similar kind of scenario here. Treat security issues as importantly as a, you know, any other type of a system outage or something like that. Don't forget the non-security tools. You know, we've been talking a lot about mass destructive malware. It's one of our fundamental predictions. It's certainly ransomware has been an issue. So make sure you back up the data, either mirrored or keep it offline, those types of things. And then last but not least, you remember the basics. You know, anything that's exposed to the internet, particularly when you're working in a cloud environment, the tendency will be that you're going to have administrative interfaces that are perhaps exposed to the internet. There are probably controls that you can put in place to say, you know, I'm only going to be coming from this address, so use that firewall to your advantage. But on top of that, use multi-factor authentication to make sure that somebody can't be successfully doing password guessing attacks. Have we ever talked about password guessing attacks on this program?
I don't think we, no,
You know,
of course we have.
I think we have. I think just 2 weeks ago, Jim Clausing went through a big dissertation on and a very interesting one on password guessing activities. So, you know, use unique accounts per user, no root access without first logging in as a normal user, and it basically, as I said earlier, least privileges. So lots of good suggestions. I've been kind of rambling here, but it was a very short article, very much worth the read. We'll provide the URL, and I recommend that, like I said, if you're going to cloud or doing things in cloud, make sure you have some good cloud-specific practices in place. Many of them are really basic, you know, just good practices overall, but I think deserve that that cloud perspective. Anything else? Did I miss something?
I think you did good.
All right, so let's move on here. And Matt, let's go back to you. And Dridex botnet got dried up?
Hijacked, I guess is the right way. So this is an interesting one from Avira, and they have a bit of a skin in the game here. Mm-hmm. Turns out that someone, and not Avira, according to Avira, hijacked a portion of the Dridex botnet. Now Dridex is known for sending out spam containing doc files which have macros. Someone opens the doc, the macros run, it grabs the secondary payload and installs that. That payload, apparently someone had found a way to get to those staging servers and replace the payload with Avira antivirus. Mm-hmm. Completely legitimate Avira antivirus installers, signed code, the whole deal. Mm-hmm. So what happens is people would, you know, if they fell for the fish, they'd open up the doc file and they'd get a free copy of Avira instead of malware, mm-hmm. which is interesting, a little bit funny. It's not clear who did this yet. Right. People were speculating it could be a white hat because people have seen this happen to CryptoLocker and Tesla Crypt installations as well, where somehow Avira got bundled in with those. Some speculation is that this might be an attempt by someone, and this is one of the lesser probable theories, but one of the more interesting ones in my opinion, is that someone might be using this in order to trick automated defenses that are looking for these packages and getting the MD5 hash or the SHA hash and throwing it into a antivirus and saying, this is the latest of the Dridex campaign, please block this whenever you see it, as in doing that to Avira. But that's probably not happening. I don't think it's quite as effective, but it is kind of funny. The one thing about this is whoever is doing it, regardless of the fact that it is kind of an interesting joke to play on the people who are running this botnet, that they're still installing software that the people never asked for.
Right.
It's still illegal. So.
Yeah, I love this and I hate it. I mean, I love it in the sense that this really is an example of how some malicious activity could potentially be dampered. And there have been some controlled cases of this, but there also have been some massive screw-ups and things like this. So going back to history again, this is like the program of flashbacks. Welcher worm was actually, in my opinion, at least the first example that I know of malware that was intended to be not mal, goodware. It immediately followed. It was like 2 weeks after the blaster worm. This would have been that 2003, something like that. So it's going back a little bit in time. You were probably in middle school at the time, is that right?
It sounds about right.
So in any case, the blaster worm, it basically exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows and basically spread wildly across the internet. And the Welcher worm basically took advantage of that same exploit. That is, the blaster worm didn't fix the problem when it got in there. Well, the Welcher worm came in behind it, did the same exploit, would exploit right on top of the blaster worm, download the patches to fix the problem, but the problem was that it didn't go away. It would go and try to find others to try to fix. And then the problem on top of that is the randomization they used to find new addresses. It started from the same address every time. And we basically go through sequentially. So there was a certain address block that it beat the living daylights out of. And there was actually a period of time where that worm was actually represented 40% of the connections on our network. Just creating, trying to scan around and look for things. So it was actually a significant deal. Now there was a period where it actually had a drop dead date that was programmed into it, and that was the only reason it ever went away. But it was a really significant event. So that was a case where it appeared to be good intentions gone awry, and that's the risk that you run with a case like this. Now, installing a perfectly legitimate piece of antivirus probably is not going to cause significant issues, but what if that had been accidentally installed on we'll say a medical device and didn't recognize the circumstances or caused some type of a performance issue? It would be an uncomfortable situation. And in any case where there might be millions, there are going to be a handful of cases where there might be a significant impact. So that's the real challenge that comes with these kinds of cases.
And before anybody says, I don't think anyone would ever open up a malware-laden email on a medical device or a point of sale, we've seen that happen. We've definitely seen people, downloading games to their point of sale systems and the like. So this, I think, is pretty feasible.
Yeah. And your point is correct as well, that in order to conduct that, I don't know how it could have been done without some illegal act taking place along the way. So obviously this actor is remaining anonymous. There was another case, it was the Carno worm, which wasn't actually fixing a problem, but it compromised a lot of things to survey the internet for things that could be compromised. It was kind of it was a surveying tool, but in this act of doing that, didn't do it in a very ethical way.
Well, you've also got Reincarna, which someone else released recently that does the same kind of thing where it closes up telnet.
It's attempting to try to clean things up, right?
Attempting to, but again, doesn't have authorization. It's always somebody else's machine. And that's one of the interesting things about botnet takedowns. If you ever read about case studies of those, it's always like, you have to spend so much time making sure that whatever you're deciding to do, you're doing it on thousands of other people's machines. You really can't predict what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And doing it without permission and screwing up is a lot worse than well, maybe it's not worse, but it certainly puts a lot more risk in your court.
It's a very much an unknown, and so that's one of the, when folks ask, why don't you just take the botnet down or something like that, it really is a complex issue to deal with. So I'm glad you brought this article, because I think it's important for us to kind of revisit some of these things and at least understand what the risks of one thing versus another are, and consider the fact that even though it's a good thing, the means may be not quite correct, but
and the impact is probably more than anyone can fathom, any one person.
I guess what I was trying to say is the ends don't always justify the means.
Who said that?
I don't know. I did. It was it goes way too far back to even be interesting. So okay, Stan, on the the dire malware.
A lot of D malware today.
Yeah. So tell us about it.
Well, apparently there's been a decline. Some security researchers are reporting there's a decline in the dire malware since probably November of last year. And there was a Reuters article that kind of said that in November, there was, in some building, some company called 25th Floor in a high-rise in Moscow, a raid by the Russian police, the FSB, and around that, and they suspect, and some unconfirmed sources or close sources are saying that this is true, that possibly somebody involved with that botnet or that malware was being investigated. So they're kind of linking this to the decline in the malware. What's interesting about there is that that company was actually working on a script for a movie called The Botnet. And it's actually, I don't know if that movie will ever come out or not now, but they were supposed to have some like pretty, well-known actors in there. It's going to be this whole big thing. So they were part of producing this movie, and possibly, maybe involved in some of that type of activity. What's interesting for us is that since November of last year, we've actually observed an increase in another type of malware called ThreatTraq, and that comes usually like in phishing campaigns. And I think it might also be related to Dridex, or that Dridex and ThreatTraq have been kind of competing since November of last year. So it is kind of interesting, that maybe the dire malware went away, but certainly not the appetite for having malware that steals users' credentials and running on machines. That hasn't gone away. And
no, not at all. In fact, it's been a growing.
Yes, exactly,
activity,
and it's been an increase in that type of distribution.
Yeah, and I think it's diversified quite a bit as well. Again, the evolution versus revolution kind of thing. I think it's been very much an evolution. It used to just go after, the early password stealers were going after banking credentials, and they would even target specific banks. And then it started to diversify to other things, and basically any type of online commerce activity is subject to that sort of thing now. And you don't even have to see the evidence of the attacks. All you have to do is, the user experience that you have with online purchasing organizations is a clear indication. They're not doing, putting all these checks and balances and offering two-factor authentication for fun. They're doing it because they're trying to deal with a set of issues and reduce the shrinkage and that type of thing. So, and I think there have been a number of cases. Well, certainly the social engineering or the social networking attack activities, like the Syrian Electronic Army. A lot of those are based on password credential stealing activities as well, although perhaps not malware based. Actually, I think some of them were, but I don't think attributable to Dire or ThreatTraq necessarily. But in any case. Good story. So let's, John, maybe you can walk us through our quiz for this
quiz, the quiz for the period. Every time I show up, I got to give you a quiz, right? I got to see. Some of these are going to challenge some of the younger ones, and some of them will challenge the older ones. Maybe that's.
So we'll look at history yet again.
So the first question is, which of these, and I list 4 historical browsers, are still supported today? So A is World Wide Web, which came out in 1990. B is Lynx, which came out in 1992. C is NCSA Mosaic, which came out in 1993, and D is UDWWW, which came out in 1995.
Well, I'm going to just put in my first little hint here. It may be a deceptive hint.
Oh, so not a hint?
Well, almost every single website I ever go to starts with www something.
That's right.
Almost every site. There's got to be something to that.
Well, I'm pretty sure I know where I think it's links.
I
use links.
I'm also going with links because I'm pretty sure I can still get it.
I think it's links too.
I think you were trying to trick us.
I was trying to trick you. So, John, what's the answer?
The answer is links, and that's good. A lot of these guys are still kind of around in some format. Like you said, World Wide Web is pretty ubiquitous, but Mosaic became Netscape in kind of a twisted way, which now is Firefox. So you see it. I always laugh at Mosaic whenever I see it. It was the first browser I ever used. Right. I very well remember it. And I remember where you downloaded it from was a server called Bastille at the University of Illinois Champaign, in Urbana-Champaign. Yeah. And I still remember that FTP, getting that FTP command at the command line to get that browser.
Mm-hmm. So for links, that's the one of choice for command line browsing, right? So that's I think anybody that recognizes links is probably like a command line.
Well, I remember when I first used it was a friend of mine said you got to try setting up Gentoo, which anybody who's a Linux user has tried setting up Gentoo, at least back in the day. It was like, okay, you start and it takes you 24 hours to just set up Gentoo, and then you go, what do I do with this thing? But you'd had to basically set up your entire. The instructions they gave you would say, go fire up links and go to the website and browse through the wiki and get your instructions here, and that was the only way to do it because you hadn't got a full system yet.
Mm-hmm. All right, next one, John. Good.
All right, so here's actually a question that might show up on a CISSP exam. So for those of you who haven't taken it yet, this is a question that may be there. So in the Kerberos protocol, TGT refers to A, thrice given token, B, attention gathering tome, C, ticket granting ticket, or D, take generated tag.
Stan doesn't.
I feel
this one should be easy, guys. Come on now.
Is it the ticket granting ticket?
I'm going with that too. What do you say, John?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You got to remember in Kerberos you have tickets, but you can't get a ticket until you get a ticket granting you that ticket.
Yeah. Yep. So there you go. So this
All
one.
right. So now here's a controversial one because this has got lots of answers, and I have to apologize for this question in advance.
Okay.
Because this one could be a little tricky. So which of these is the best semiconductor? And let me preface this and add an addendum at high let's see, it would be high voltage.
High voltage. Okay.
So A, gallium nitride, B, germanium, C, silicon carbide, D, diamond, or E, silicon.
So my first instinct is to go with diamond D, but you've thrown in that at high voltage, and that's where my domain of knowledge ends. I don't know how it changes as voltage changes. So I'm going to stick with D.
All right.
I was going to go with silicon.
You're going to go with silicon?
It's a very important difference.
Ah, okay.
All right. Mine is A, gallium nitride.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is, like I said, this one's really screwy because when you talk about semiconductors, you talk about what they call band gap, which is how well it at high voltage how well it serves. So diamond is actually really well is the answer for high voltage, but and it's thin. You can make thin high voltage semiconductor for diamond. But when you start, this is where the twist gets in, is when you talk cost, you talk about size, you talk about imperfections, it could be any of these depending upon the right circumstance. Silicon is usually what we see, of course, in computers just because it's cheap.
It's actually, I think in particular, it's cheap to manufacture. That's the real trick. Yeah.
Yep, and it doesn't have a lot of imperfections because some of these will actually get like little needles. Like when you make them, they don't come out perfect. So it's really a tricky manufacturing process. But so it depends on the circumstance. Diamond for the high voltage because it has a electron volt. The gap itself is like 5.5, which is really high. So high temperature, high voltage. But when you start talking the lower voltages and the cost, it can be really any of these.
Well, I have to admit, I actually studied semiconductor design in college, but it's been 30 years, and quite frankly, I hadn't even really thought of diamond as a semiconductor. But gallium nitride is used in solar cells.
Okay.
It's also used in gallium arsenide, which is basically they use it in very high frequency microwave, a lot of space applications, things like that.
I was more familiar
The trade-off,
with solar panels.
Yeah, the trade-off with that is that it's very expensive to manufacture, whereas silicon has a really neat proposition or a property that you can oxidize it easily, which turns it into an insulator, and then you can etch that oxide, which becomes actually an etching or a pattern for depositing metals and things like that, so it becomes much easier to do the manufacturing associated.
And isn't the gallium nitride, like you mentioned, it's really dangerous too if you don't do it right. You can like wipe out half the block.
Yeah, minor details.
John, I would say the next time you
That's why they call it Silicon Valley, so it stays in the.
I was going to say next time you have engineering constraints, you should probably mention them in the question.
I know it was a bad,
I just said
it was a bad
best.
question.
All right, so let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and we're going to do this rather quickly. I guess, the first item on the list here is the top 10 most probed ports. Port 23 at the top. It's been that way for quite some time. I guess I will point out, though, and I often don't point this out, but we have, in this case, a category of other, which actually is the dominant portion of the pie here. But within that other, there are actually, in this case, 2,253 other ports that are contributing to that. So it just gives you a little bit of idea how deep that distribution goes in terms of the number of ports that are being scanned on a given day. 2,200 is a little bit on the high side. I think we typically see more like maybe 700 or so. So this is a little bit different than I think is a fairly typical day. Nevertheless, port 23 at the top of the list. We'll take a look at that a little more closely, but it's stable at the top, has been for some time. 1900 UDP, that's jumped up 21 slots, but you'll see that the overall pattern hasn't changed significantly. 53413 UDP, that's the Netis router backdoor. Hasn't changed much. We'll take a look at that. And port 22 TCP SSH hasn't moved significantly either. It actually moved down a slot to make room for that port 1900 UDP. And then 53 UDP, that's DNS. 445 TCP, still a lot of scanning for Microsoft stuff. 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database, followed by 80 TCP. We're going to be looking at 80 TCP in the context of sources probing, and then 3389, that's RDP, and I think we have a graph for that one later on as well. So taking a look at the scan probes on port 23 TCP, well, it's actually stable or so over the last week or so here. We've seen the surges in activity, but it is also worthy of note that it's still in the hundreds of millions of probes per hour that we're sensing here. So although it's going down, it certainly has not diminished significantly as an overall threat. That is, hundreds of millions of probes per hour, just from our perspective, means that the entire internet is being scanned within, or at least certainly within a handful of hours. Scan probes on port 1900 UDP, that's SSDP, Simple Service Discovery Protocol, which is really a LAN protocol. A lot of this has been blocked, but there's still some basically we still have some visibility into the activity that's taking place. We're looking at the last 180 days, and what we're seeing more recently is not significantly different than what we've seen over the last 180 days or so. It's been up or down. It is, I think, interesting to note, like, where you see these gaps in activity, which basically suggests that this is not like a crowdsourcing activity in a sense. There are not a lot of contributors, that there are basically, when a particular actor stops, a lot of it really dries up and there's just a lower noise floor. So it's not as if there are a lot of actors that are contributing to this activity. And generally speaking, they're scanning around looking for these servers. They're exposed to the internet and can use those for reflective denial of service attacks. And in some cases, these spikes can actually be associated with the request side of those attacks. And it's very sometimes difficult to detect or distinguish between those in the flow data. Next item here is scan probes on port 53413 UDP. As I mentioned, this is a Netis router backdoor. which is a case where you can just throw a packet that has some scripting information in there, and if the router accepts it through that back door, it will actually execute those scripts, and then usually it basically commands it to download some additional scripts and turn it into a bot and do some other things. So we're looking at the last 60 days of activity here. Not a significant change other than I think the general trend is that this is becoming more significant, that is a gradual increase in activity, and more stable. That is, we used to see surges in activity and then a drop, but it looks like what they've done is what I like to refer to as gone into maintenance mode. They've basically built up a botnet, and they're just going around and scanning from time to time to basically keep that botnet at the strength that they're desiring here. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, at the top of the list here, well, actually just taking a quick look on port 23, top of the list, and I just wanted to put this in the context here. Over the course of a day, we detected on the order of, I think it's closer to 147,000 unique source addresses that we're scanning on port 23 TCP through the course of the day. Now, in a given hour, we only see a segment of those. They may not hit our address space or something along those lines, but just they're at the very least 250,000 sources that were, effectively compromised in doing the scanning activity on the internet yesterday. Moving to port 53413, well, I think we're going to take a look at that one, and then the other one I think we'll take a look at here is port 80 TCP. Looking at the scan sources in port 23, relatively stable, basically consistent with the last graph we had looked at, looking at the last 90 days of activity here. And then 53413, as we had observed earlier, relatively stable activity. Again, it is sort of interesting to note sort of drops in activity, which basically indicates that it's a single actor that's doing this, and it's not a coincidence that a whole bunch of those are going away. So there may be, there may be a handful of actors that are scanning or probing on this port, but it's not as if there are dozens or hundreds or thousands. And then looking at scan sources on port 80 TCP over the last 60 days, we have seen a couple of spikes on this over that time period, and most recently in the last day or so here. I don't really have a good explanation for this other than to point out that it looked like the sources were kind of weighted in Mexico and Russia and the United States, not necessarily in that order. So kind of an interesting characteristic, and perhaps worth taking a little closer look at to see the reason for that. There's also some research activity that's taking place that contributes to this, but just to put this into perspective, we're looking at an increase on the order of maybe, looks like about 2,000 source addresses that were participating here. So there's clearly a botnet behind that activity. And last here is scan sources on port 3389. That's remote desktop protocol. Over the last couple of weeks, we reported a couple of surges in terms of the number of sources that were doing that scanning. This first one that was back in the, I guess, the middle of January, clearly had the characteristics of a botnet, with these cases where a command was put out, a bunch of bots started doing the scanning, and then it had that sort of that telltale sort of degradation in activity. This last one was a little bit different, perhaps the same botnet doing it, but perhaps it was told to discontinue that activity. So it basically abrupted, or perhaps somebody put a block in place on the command and control. It's very difficult to say what caused that. But nevertheless, it's back to what I would guess call stable, only a mere 2,000 sources doing that scanning activity on a given hour. So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at att-ThreatTraq@list.att.com. And you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel, on YouTube, and on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at ATT Security. And I'd like to thank you, John Markley, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan Nurilov.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt Kaiser.
Anytime.
I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.